Okay, and we are live. So you are listening to the Misery Movies podcast, which is a miserytourism.com production, I guess. And we're on episode 8. So if you're new to the podcast, basically each episode we discuss a different movie that has a kind of misery tourism theme, a human suffering related theme. Uh, be it murder, or in the case of today's episode, child murder, or rape, incest, school shootings. I don't know. Anyway, anything that, or just like existential despair, anything that fits under that kind of misery tourism umbrella. I'm Will, and I am joined by two of our contributors, Sarah
Yo.
and AJ.
Hey.
So just to get the structure of the podcast down for first-time listeners, the first half or so of the podcast, we try to do a spoiler-free overview and review of the film, where we just talk about it generally and give our opinion, and ultimately we give it each film a rating. And then the second half of the film, we try to dive more in depth into the film. In the second half of the podcast, excuse me, in the second half of the podcast, we dive more in depth into the film. And during that portion, there are spoilers. We kind of talk about individual scenes, take them apart, talk about maybe the arc of the plot, talk about character motivations, things like that, things that you'll probably want to have seen the movie first before listening to that discussion, but we'll give you fair warning before we transition to that part of the podcast. So um, today we're going to be discussing the 1931, I believe, Fritz Lang classic M, which Sarah selected. So Sarah, why don't you get us started by telling us a little bit about the film?
All right. Well, basic plot. It is about a child serial killer running around this particular town in Germany, and I believe by the first few minutes of the film, 8 children have been murdered.
Something like that.
So, yeah, I think it's more than I expected actually. So he is a legitimate serial killer, and you know how I feel about serial killers. I love them, but yeah. So basically, the movie follows certain characters who are trying to find this guy, not only because he's killing their children, but he's kind of messing with their lives. The police are doing all of these raids because they're desperate to find him, and it's just, yeah.
Yeah, and the raids are hard on the city's criminal underground. So
yeah.
the basically the mob also organizes a kind of task force to bring him down as well.
Yeah.
And you have these two parallel searches going on for the same killer, one being done by the police and the other being done by basically organized crime, which is interesting. And of course,
That's why I love this movie.
yeah, that is, I think, one of the real selling points of the movie, is that it's not just a straightforward serial killer film. It's not a straightforward police procedural type of film. It's actually it's almost these two parallel procedurals, and you get to see how the cops go about tracking him and how the criminals go about tracking him, and they use different methods for sure. But we're also kind of bearing the lead here, which is that the killer is played by none other than Peter Lorre, who is probably one of cinema's greatest character actors, particularly when it comes to playing villains, or kind of these kind of dark, troubled, mentally unhinged characters.
Yeah, and I think the first film that I saw Peter Lorre in was Arsenic and Old Lace, actually. So if anybody has seen that,
I have.
he was skinny in that. So the M was before he lost the weight.
Yeah,
I think it was before. Yeah.
Yeah, no, M is definitely much earlier in his career in
Yeah. He was very
Arsenic
young
and
in
Old
that.
Lace. Because actually, he was initially a German actor,
Mm-hmm.
and he got his start in German cinema. M was his breakout role, actually, and then not long after M, he ended up fleeing Germany because of little something called the Nazis happened, and he ended up first in England, and his first English speaking role was in Hitchcock's original British version of The Man Who Knew Too Much. And when
Right.
I actually just watched that recently, and I was reading up about it, and when Peter Lorre signed on to do that role, he didn't know English at all. So he and you wouldn't know this by watching it, but he did all of his lines phonetically. He learned all of his
Oh,
lines phonetically and recited them all phonetically. So he didn't actually know, much like
what
I
he was
guess
saying.
Arnold Schwarzenegger in some of his films. He didn't quite know what he was saying when he was saying it, but he was such a talented actor and he had such a good grasp of like the essence of his character and what to do with
Mhm.
intonations and stuff, that you would never for a minute believe that this wasn't someone who was who at least understood the English language. And then after that, he ended up in Hollywood, and he ended up being cast as villains in a lot of Hollywood movies, including Arsenic and Old Lace, and Casablanca, and The Maltese Falcon, and so on and so forth. But yeah, and I thought that he was absolutely tremendous in this movie. I mean, I don't know
Oh,
what did you
definitely he
guys think
was.
of Peter Lorre's performance?
No, I loved him. He was so convincing because there's something almost smug about him.
Yeah,
See that too, but also obviously just super creepy, and you can immediately believe that this is the guy playing the child killer. Yes, but no, he really pulled it off, and I'm not going to get into any spoilers, but at the end, he really goes into this crazy monologue, and he just nails it. He pulls it off so
yeah,
well. I don't think a lot of actors could do that.
yeah,
And just it's everything because he's kind of got the buggy eyes,
yeah.
and so he's very expressive, which goes
He
well
is.
with this kind
He
of
is.
character.
He is, and he's also he's really fascinating. In terms of like both his physical appearance and his performances, but just talking about his physical appearance, he exists in this really weird, wonderful space where at one point he on one level he's like innately creepy, but on another level he also has this like childlike vulnerability going on
Mhm.
where like at the same time he looks like, like a child and like someone who would abduct and kill a child, you know? And it's a balance that works really well in this film because he had, as you said, and a lot of times in his later Hollywood films, that kind of smarmy side of his character is played up more. Like he's often cast as these kind of guys who are, as you said, like condescending on one hand, deeply creepy on another,
Mhm.
and are kind of and who exude a certain kind of confidence and power while also being deeply like giving you the willies. But in this film really plays up his vulnerable side more, so he can be in one scene like simultaneously you see, oh my god, that guy's a creep, I'm scared of that guy, and in another scene you're really scared for him, and the way
Mhm.
that he
Mhm.
makes it that pendulum swing back and forth, the range on display there is really really fascinating. But AJ, what were your thoughts?
I basically just agree with everything that's been said previously, but in addition, like just to kind of piggyback off of that, there's several moments in the film where like you can see that he's really scared, and it works so well because of his weird eyes. Of like he's got these wide, like there was a moment in the film where I was like watching and I was like, that doesn't look real. He
Yeah,
doesn't look real. But
yeah,
I really really love the scenes where he looks scared just because he looks so odd. And also
right.
like you end up sympathizing.
Right.
Well, I know there was this one moment that where he's apparently. By the way, there's tons and tons of window shopping in this movie. Everybody just
There is a
window
lot.
shop. Kids do. The serial killer does. Everybody's at the window shops. So there's this one scene where he's eyeing. What were they, like weapons, something like that? So he's window shopping and just looking at the weapons, really interested. And then his face just like drops. And in the reflection, you see this little girl, and his whole demeanor changes. And he's like, I don't know if I want to describe it as like lust, because that's really creepy. But it's kind of on par with that, where he's just like overcome with whatever he's feeling. And, obviously he starts following her. So that was a really interesting and obviously disturbing moment.
Yeah, and
Really
I mean,
well.
a major theme of this film, or a major question that this film, I think, poses, but I think leaves intentionally unanswered, is the degree to which he can control his compulsions, the degree to which he is voluntarily engaging in this murderous behavior. Like, when he sees a child, to what degree can he help himself? And to what degree are his crimes premeditated or totally compulsive? And I think we can talk about that probably a little more in the second half of the podcast. But I think the movie leaves that question open to a pretty large degree. But you mentioned the window shopping, which is, I think, something that's pretty interesting about this film that probably gets overlooked to some degree, is just how much of a role class plays in this. Because I mean, at this point, it's kind of a cliche to have the serial killer who buys, as Peter Lorre's as Peter Lorre's character does, who basically lures his victims in by buying them sweets, buying them gifts and stuff. And I think in a lot of movies, that's just played as, oh, these poor vulnerable kids. But in this movie, it's very clear, although it's never stated overtly, that he's preying on working class kids in the immediate aftermath of a global depression, when it's very clear that these kids, like, candy or a balloon is a pretty big fucking deal to them. And it's actually established in the working class nature of all this is established right in the opening shot or set of shots, when we see one of the mothers of the victims, and she's a washerwoman. And she's not only a washerwoman, but she's a single mother too. If you notice, she sets only 2 dishes on the table, one for herself and one for her child. And the child who Peter Lorre is ultimately going to kill in one of the establishing scenes of the film. And so you start off immediately like aware of the role that class plays in the film. The fact that, and Peter Lorre's character, he's not an upper class character because he's renting a room and this and that, but he's well dressed. He obviously has some kind of disposable income to spend on candy and balloons for kids he's going to murder. And he seems somewhat educated. And so there's this clear class distinction. And also, like, with the police and the difference between the police and the criminals. And there's also a scene fairly early that seems like a throwaway scene, but where there's a bunch of these basically fat cat guys gathered around a table, these businessmen looking guys eating this nice meal, and then they start accusing each other of being the killer, and they get and so there's definitely something going on here where these crimes are being committed at one level, which is basically Peter Lorre's character is preying on these working class children, but the ramifications are like spreading through society. It's like the panic is spreading through all layers of society, right?
It is. And you can see that mostly in how the police react, and then how society acts towards the police because it's really disrupting their lives.
Right.
At one point, you almost question, wait, do they care more about the dead children or just not being raided?
Well, I think in the case
Because
of
it's ruining their businesses, but
right, I think in the case of the kind of criminal underworld, they're definitely more interested in having the status quo return than in, avenging the murdered children or anything.
I think
But
that you made an excellent point though, about the correlation of the window shopping and then the working class families, and because I was gonna say it's different like with maybe the first 2 or 3 murders, and maybe word doesn't get around to everybody, but at this point everybody knows that people are paranoid. So you think, well, they're telling their children about this, maybe don't talk to strangers, blah blah blah, but you still have all these kids who are like, actually, yeah, I fucking want candy and I want a balloon, and they're not thinking that, oh yeah, mom told me don't accept candy or whatever from strangers, don't talk to strangers.
right, and these
So
kids,
that was kind of interesting.
and on
that
top
they're-
of that, you have kids who have to walk home from school alone
Mhm.
because they
Yeah.
are from single parent households where the mother is working and the kid is. So there's definitely something going on there, but I want to get AJ in on this.
Wow, I feel put on the spot. I don't really have that much of an opinion about it. I mean, it
Damn it,
was
AJ.
present,
Damn
but like, and I'm sure it has some significance, but
Right.
yeah, I don't really.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I think this movie is sociological in a way that a lot of the movies that came after it that borrowed heavily from it aren't.
Mm.
What I actually kept thinking about when I was watching this film, and this may be odd, but the thing that kept coming to mind for me is The Wire more than anything else. And I don't know if either of you have seen The Wire, the HBO series.
Nope.
I haven't.
Oh, okay.
Got it.
Well,
But I hope there are a bunch of murdered children in it.
there were actually few murdered children in it, but it's basically a on the surface it seems like a kind of police procedural about the drug trade in Baltimore, but it's actually a lot deeper than that in that you have like if you take your standard police procedural, what happens, right? A crime is committed, and immediately maybe you see the crime happen or the aftermath of the crime, but then very soon afterwards, you're following the cops, right, as they track the criminal. But the interesting thing about The Wire, which is also, I think, somewhat true, or maybe more than somewhat true of this film, is that you get this very broad, sweeping portrait of an entire city, right? You're just not just following the cops as they track a killer, or following a couple of cops, a few cops, while they try to run down a drug dealer or something. Instead, in The Wire, you have a whole bunch of different police characters, and you see like the differing incentives that exist within the Baltimore Police Department, where like you're the people at the top who are just trying to get the stats, right? They just want to make sure that the stats look good, because they have to answer to City Hall. And then you have the cops on the bottom who are maybe trying to solve the crimes to some degree, but are being hindered by the expectations from the top, and so on and so forth. And you have this whole interconnected like ecosystem there. But you also get to see like all of the different people who are taking part in the drug trade in Baltimore, from like, the corner boys who actually sell the drugs, to the people who are more responsible on an organizational level, right? The kingpins and the middle management guys and not the drug cartels, but in these gangs, basically in these street gangs that are selling drugs in the city. And you see all that, the interconnections there, and all the ways that like a decision that one person makes kind of ripples outward through that, and the way that like these competing incentives in some way hamstring different characters and prevent people from getting the result they want, not so much because of anything they're doing, but because of the way this interconnected system is self-defeating. And I think you see that too in this film, which I was shocked. I was shocked at how sophisticated this and almost ahead of its time this film is in that way, because you get,
I agree with that, actually.
not only do you get a pretty complex view of the police department where you see, yeah, there's a couple of detectives who you see more than others, but you also see like the guy who's doing really bad, by the way, handwriting analysis in one scene. You see the guy who goes from door to door canvassing. You see all these different, you see the higher ups giving orders to the lower level cops. You see like the raids that they do, even though the raid doesn't necessarily lead anywhere. Earlier in the scene, you see where they raid a nightclub, or speakeasy or something. And then on the criminal side, you see a whole bunch of different criminal characters and how they're interacting with each other, and you see this whole other underground economy and underground society, and you see how they're all working together to try to catch, well, not together, working together in some instances, working against each other, competing with each other, etc., to try to catch this one man who's thrown the whole ecosystem into disarray. Who has there was this kind of delicate balance that existed before, where maybe sometimes the cops looked the other way or whatever, and the criminals, and they all had the status quo that they were maintaining. And then this guy has disrupted it all, and you get to see the chaos that results. And on that level, I think it was especially the early parts of this movie were a lot more interesting than a standard police procedural. And I was really shocked that a movie from 1931 that on some level was just in the process of creating these genres. I don't know if this was the first ever serial killer movie, but it's certainly one of the first.
And it's funny because a lot of those points are still relevant today, aren't they?
Right.
Really, I mean, yeah, like police procedural was a little different back then. Forensics, obviously, they've
Right.
taken off, but it's still pretty relevant the way they interact with each other and compete with each other and interfere. Like you said, with the people at the top, with the people at the bottom who are actually working on it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's so much more complex, and it's weird because it's almost as if serial killer films have it's almost as if you can see everything that's good about the serial killer genre at work in this film, and that like movies that have gone back to this well since then have been taking water out but not putting any water back in, if that makes any sense. Like they've been whittling it down, and a lot of the interesting stuff. Like I can't think of another film about the hunt for a serial killer that is this sociologically deep and complex. Maybe if anyone actually listens to this podcast, maybe, hey, send us an example. We'll talk about it next time. But I can't think of any. I can think of some that may have taken a single element from this film and focused more tightly on it. Like so many serial killer films have taken the psychological depth that you can already see at play here in terms of portraying like the inner conflict of the killer, and really made that the whole ball game, really focused in on that, or have taken the part about the cops chasing the killer, and especially about having this kind of unconventional detective, I guess, chasing the killer, and really focused on that element, but no, I don't think that I've ever seen one that is this broad and this complete. Even though in some ways this is the progenitor of the genre. This, in some ways, created all those movies. All those movies are ripping this film off, but
not very well.
Not very well. Even things that you think, how many. Here's something that I read on Wikipedia that totally blew my mind. So how many movies about serial killers or killers in general have there been where there's a musical, some kind of creepy musical cue that lets you know the killer is there, right? Every single
Good
one of
point.
them. Every single one. But what blew my mind, though, is not only is this the first movie where they've used a kind of creepy musical, and this is a better creepy musical cue than most of the others because it just said, oh, hold that thought. But anyway, not only is this the first movie to have a little creepy snippet of like kind of cheery but still disturbing music associated with the killer that lets you know the killer's there and like sets you up emotionally for it. But get this is the first film ever to use a musical cue to denote a character and to let the like this is it's something that was used in opera before this, but this is the first film to have a piece of music associated with a specific character that lets you know that character is there even when they're off screen. So
Huh.
it broke that ground in addition to like just the amount of innovation that took place, that just the amount of innovation that there is going on just to get the scenes with the whistling, right, which are so
Yes.
innately effective and which have been ripped off millions and millions and millions, well, hundreds of times at least though since then in different ways. To have all that groundwork laid in one film and to have it been done frankly better than like, you know, having some like mentally ill child sing a nursery rhyme or something, you know, like to have like I think it's in the Hall of the Mountain King or something like that, something Mountain King, that is the musical cue. I thought at first it was from Peter and the Wolf, frankly, which shows you how much I know about music, but to have like the cue is it's so perfect because on the one hand it has this kind of innate innocence to it, but it's also ominous and it doesn't play either of those sides too much. Like right, like as I said, now it's always a fucking they're gonna like Mary, you know, it's gonna be Mary had a little lamb, and she's gonna sing it in a creepy voice. But it's just so subtle here, the whistling, and it does so much. But yeah,
Those were so creepy, and to the point where, you know, I don't. Well, it's probably a spoiler, but not too much. But where another character starts recognizing this whistling, he's like, "Wait a minute, I've heard that before." Yeah,
right.
you have. It's really creepy when you can't see the person, but you know they're there, and you know they've probably been there.
Right. And that's another thing about the whistling is it has plot utility as opposed to just being creepy for creepy's sake. So it succeeds on so many different levels. Yes. Oh, it just while we're talking about the whistling, there's this one by the way, another thing I read, apparently Peter Lorre couldn't whistle at all. So that's the whistling is all dubbed over the soundtrack, which has a really cool.
I kind of figured. When during that one scene when he went to that little cafe or whatever, and he started drinking cognac. It kind of hit him, but he was still whistling. I'm like, he's fucking not whistling in real life.
And you know what? I was just going to mention that scene because an amazing thing happens in that scene because where it's very clear that he's not whistling anymore, but the whistling goes on. And
yeah.
And it's almost like the whistling is going on inside of his head, which is another really sophisticated technique that you wouldn't, that like way that which you almost take for granted now, right? But which to have that, think about this, like in the same film that created just the concept of, once again, it was done in opera and in musical theater before this, but for film purposes that created the concept of having a musical cue associated with a character. It was also the first film to have that musical cue like go from being externally like a function of like the character's like to have the character actually be performing the musical cue, to have the character be performing the music, and then to have it become clear that the character is no longer doing it, but to have the music still playing, and it has this kind of it becomes this kind of psychological thing. It becomes this kind of manifestation of his psychological disturbance where he can't get the whistling out of his head. Like, to have all of that done in one film for the first time, it's like, well, what has any serial killer movie since this film brought to the genre? I don't know.
And also keeping in mind that this is 1931, there's nothing graphic here. Like in today's movies where you see the beheaded corpse, you see someone getting raped, yada yada. In this, there's none of that. But it's still absolutely compelling.
See, that's a good point. That's what future films have contributed to this genre. Excess. Graphic, like, pointless bullshit. Yeah. Anyway, AJ, you've been...
I'll mention a scene that I really liked. So at one point in time, there's a character that interacts. It's a man, and he interacts with a little girl, and everyone's kind of on hyper alert at this point in time.
Oh yeah.
And so I forget exactly what happened, but like another character comes up and starts accusing him of being the killer, and then like the police are called, and he's like, somehow a crowd amasses, and they're all accusing him of being the killer, and just because he was, talking to a little girl. And I really enjoyed that scene because it reminded me of like things in Songs from the Second Floor, and that one scene in Suicide Club where they were all like, yeah, let's jump off the roof, let's do it,
Right.
It really highlights the kind of paranoia and
mass hysteria.
Mass hysteria.
Yeah, mass hysteria, exactly. I enjoyed that part.
Which I think is another thing this film potentially pioneered. Another element of the genre that you see sometimes that this film pioneered. Like, it's all there. And you know what else? This is also Fritz Lang's first talkie. This is the first film he made that even had sound in it. So it's kind of nuts. One thing, though, on that note that I did want to talk about is that when you have a film like this that has been ripped off so much since it was made, sometimes it can have a detrimental effect in some weird way on the legacy of the original film, or in your ability to like sit down and watch the film with a fresh pair of eyes and really appreciate the film. Like, just an example, when I was a teenager, I watched Casablanca for the first time, and I sat down and I watched it, and being a dumb teenager, after it was over, it was like, yeah, but, I've seen all of that before. And the truth is, of course I'd seen it before, because Casablanca has been ripped off scene by scene by scene by hundreds and hundreds of movies since then. I mean, it's a movie that has become a template. And I think that when a movie becomes a template, a lot of what's innovative about that movie is potentially lost to future audiences. Where, since I don't think any of us went into M having never seen a serial killer movie before, having not seen, say, Silence of the Lambs or one of countless other worse serial killer movies, to what degree... I don't know. This is my open question to you. To what degree do you think that hampered your appreciation of the film? To what degree do you think this film, I don't know, how do you think it compares?
I definitely think that that's an issue, particularly for me. Like, I'm almost still stuck in that dumb teenager state of, I mean, it's good, but it's in black and white, and I've seen it all before. Like, I could see color versions of it elsewhere.
Curation.
I have no taste, and I admit that, but Yeah, basically, I think that was. I think that becomes an issue, particularly with younger audiences.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have a point there about younger audiences in that there's a certain point, I think, in everyone's development where they've seen enough films to have a vague idea of like genre and to like have some sense of what your expectations are going into a film, but not enough films to really take any given film and really put it in context. So you have this vague sense of having seen these things before and being unimpressed, but not you haven't quite had enough experience with movies to see what's exceptional about this particular example of the form, if that makes
Right,
any
right.
sense.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But I don't know, I want to get Sarah in on this as well.
Oh no, no, Will, Jesus, no. Yeah, I watched this. I don't know how old I was. I was probably a teenager when I first watched it. I watched it with my brother actually. I loved it. I was so wowed, I think, by the last half of the movie that it
Mm,
really stuck with me up until now. And of course, as always, when you loved a movie when you were younger, I'm always scared that I'm going to hate it because I have watched a ton of movies in between. And even though I'd watched serial killer movies before that and it hadn't really impacted me negatively in that way, I was less wowed this time around, but I
mm.
still liked it and I still really appreciated the way they went about it. And I really liked how you have these, the criminals going, trying to track down the serial killer. Well, at the same time, it parallels the cops trying to track down the serial killer in different ways and coming up with, I guess they kind of came up with the same conclusion, didn't they?
Some degree.
Yeah, to some degree, but no, it's still, it has the, it's still it what's the phrase that I'm looking for? It stands the test of time.
Yeah, yeah. I think my feeling was probably a lot closer to yours, Sarah, in that I actually, I don't know, I have a real tendency to break things down into thirds, but I think that you can break this movie, I think you can break down into thirds, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but the first third of the movie, I thought, e- even still today, is very effective because of the broad kind of, like I said, sociological sweep of the film, just the scope of the film, the way that it goes from like these working class families that are most directly affected because they're losing children to the cops,
Mhm.
to the criminals who are affected by the actions of the cops, to Peter Lorre's character, the killer himself. Like as I said earlier, I don't think there are many movies that have had that kind of scope in dealing with this kind of subject matter. So I got very swept up in that. Then the second third of the movie, I kind of felt it settled into a sort of procedural kind of mode where you saw the cops trying to solve the crime and the criminals trying to catch him, and some of the techniques they were using and some of what was happening was very new then, but feels a little old hat now. And because
Mm.
of the structure, it felt like the plot wheels were turning, right? And because nothing about that plot is surprising today, there was a little bit of a lull there for me, a little bit of a lull in my ability to appreciate the film. And then the final third of the film goes off, and I don't want to talk at all about the final third of the film, but it
Well,
goes off
soon
in a
though.
really amazing direction that ties the film together really, really well thematically and does some really, frankly, like batshit stuff that that I think a lot of modern contemporary serial killer films wouldn't do. And so that I really loved that. Excuse me, I really loved that final third of the movie, probably more than any other part of the film. And I don't. When I watched this the first time I don't know, a few years ago, I think I had pretty much the same feeling about the film, where it was like I was interested at first, and then I started to get anxious as it went on, and then the ending portion of the film kicked in, and I was riveted. And I think it was pretty much the same way this time around.
Mhm.
Um,
Now, there were definitely moments in between where I admit I was getting a little bored because not much was happening, or they were talking too much and not doing enough, or they were focusing on one scene that they shouldn't have been for too long. But then again, get into that ending, that last portion, and you really can't stop watching.
yeah, and it does get very talky, especially in the middle of the film,
Mm.
which is probably partially like due to the limitations of technology and what what can you do? I mean, there's only so much you can do with sets and actors and stuff, and because once again you have a lot of this stuff that we maybe take for granted had to be explicitly stated then, because you didn't have a whole genre of films to lean on, and a whole set of expectations that you could undermine. You had to set up your expectations even as you're undermining them. So I think that's true. Any other broader topics that you want to talk about before we move into doing our reviews of the film?
No,
Well, usually in
think
these podcasts, I spend a couple minutes talking about aesthetics.
Oh yeah, AJ, why don't you
me
talk about
too. Yeah.
aesthetics?
So, my opinion of the aesthetics of this film is that there were a couple of really awesome shots in the first part of the film,
Yes.
or
Yep.
what you've referenced as, the first third. I in particular, like, a shot of the stairway from above, which we've
Yes.
like seen so many times since then, but that one in particular there's something really, really well done about it.
There is.
And another when it shows it's like the establishing, murder or whatever, of the first girl to be killed, of Peter Lorre buys her a balloon, and then, when she's supposedly being killed, the balloon floats up into the phone lines.
Yeah.
And that shot, I love that shot.
And once again, those are all shots we've seen like many, many times since then.
Right.
But they haven't been done as well since.
Right. And they're always done.
How creepy.
Like,
Sorry. Go on.
they're always done in this really excessive, over the top, like it's just made to look creepy. Like if you go into a haunted house, you're not really getting scared at all because it's fake. It's so obviously fake, but there was something more realistic, but also so stylistically potent about those shots.
Right. I mean, that opening montage, well, it's not technically an opening montage, but the montage that cuts between the killer, the victim, the child who's about to be killed, and her interactions with Peter Lorre's character, with the killer, and the way those scenes are intercut with the scenes of the mother at home waiting for her to come home.
Right.
Once again, to think that this is the first real example of this genre, and they've already got that, which we've seen repeated so many times since then. But then, just a few static shots there of the looking down the stairwell, which, as you said, we've seen a million times since then. The scene in the attic with the clotheslines, where the clothes are just sort of hanging there, and there's just something inherently, like, just those static shots build so much anxiety so effectively. Like, what is it about looking down a spiral staircase from the top that just makes all of our hearts like sink into our stomachs, right? And what is it about that like desolate view of clothes just kind of hanging there, which has been used again so many times since then, that just gets at you, that just gives you this subtle feeling of unease. And then, of course, the scene of the balloon floating into the telephone lines or the power lines or whatever they are, which we've seen which has been ripped off so many times since then. But never since then has it been such a creepy fucking looking balloon.
That was, right?
Like that weird
That's the
balloon
worst
man
balloon ever.
with his angular limbs and stuff. Like that. Every movie that has ripped this film off since then has used just like a regular balloon. And maybe if they're really ambitious, they'll pick a color that like evokes something. It's like, oh, it's a red
Usually it's a red balloon.
It's
It's
almost
like,
good.
no blood. You know.
And I think the red balloon thing is actually ripping off an entirely different movie, which I can't remember now. But that whole like it's just another example of how like this movie has been ripped off, and the movies that have ripped it off have done it worse instead of innovating on it or improving it. And I think, I know you're not going to like this, AJ, but I think this movie benefits so much from being in black and white.
No, I'd agree with you. I mean, I don't like that it is in black and white, but black and white is like grating to me.
But
It's like
if that
nails on a chalkboard.
really, oh, I love black and white films. There are so many subtle details that you can see in a black and white movie that are still present in a color film, but are for some reason like glossed over by the existence of color and the way your eye responds to color. I don't know what it is, um, but yeah, I mean, think if you had to watch that balloon man shot in color, it'd be silly. He'd be goofy looking, right? It'd be like a pink balloon with like floppy blue arms or something, and it'd be floating, and he'd be like, "Oh, it wouldn't." But that same balloon seen in grayscale is fucking terrifying.
It's true. Another thing I thought was I noted during was there's a scene where the police are interrogating like public and trying to get testimony, and they're trying to make the point of how the witnesses are basically unreliable, and they're arguing about what hat the girl was wearing, what color hat the girl was
Yeah,
wearing.
right.
And
we don't know.
And one
Yeah.
person's like, it's red. No, it's green. And we're like, we have no fucking clue. It was gray to us, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Which
And
I thought that was a cool use of it being in black and white.
And that's a good point, since so much of this film is really about ambiguity. It's about what you don't know,
Yep.
which is true of almost every great film, by the way. Pretty much every great film is about what you don't know, and then it doesn't tell you. Yeah, any other thoughts here before we do our reviews?
I would say one more thing on the black and white is that maybe I'm just lazy, or maybe I have a bit of ADHD or whatever, but black and white films sometimes, like, I have trouble understanding what character is what character. And so I just get them mixed up sometimes. So I thought
I can see that. I do
at
that too.
points during the film, I was just kind of lost of like, oh, that's a
AJ?
person.
Oh, just a second. Are you like playing with something there? I hear a lot of like, it sounds like you're fumbling with something at your desk, and it's obscuring my ability to hear what you're saying.
Damn, is it better now?
Yes, better now. So what were you saying?
So yeah, at some points during this film, I kind of got lost, especially during the middle where it was basically a bunch of police procedural stuff that was kind of boring, but also like I just couldn't like convince myself to pay attention enough.
Yeah. that's where my attention started to drift to. I think there are a lot of characters in this film. I don't know, maybe I'm suffering from the same confusion, but I think there are a lot of very small peripheral roles in this film. I mean, aside from Peter Lorre's character and the main detective, whose name escapes me,
I know there was Lowman.
Loman,
Yeah,
Inspector
I'd
Loman,
just say Lowman.
and then and then the not to be confused with Willie Loman from Death of a Salesman, which AJ informed me the other day that she had read and couldn't remember
I did.
anything.
I read it in English class, and
Eh,
I think I wrote a paper on it, and I
And
got
you
an
can't
A
remember
on that paper because I got an
that.
A on all papers I wrote in English class. So
That
you should be satisfied, Will.
that is a brilliant. No, I'm not satisfied because it's a brilliant play and you don't remember anything about it.
It was forgettable.
It was the Death of a Salesman was forgettable.
I didn't like it. It was boring. It would have been better in color.
I don't fucking know. But anyway, besides those two characters and the character, the safecracker character, who's the head of the sort of criminal underworld, or who kind of serves as the head for the purpose of the film. There's a lot of characters that only appear in a couple of scenes because there's so many characters and they're covering so much ground and the cast is so broad that it is easy to kind of lose your bearings there, I think. Anything else? Sarah, any final thoughts before we move on to our review?
I'm ready for the reviews.
Okay. Sarah, it's your film. You can give your review first.
Ooh, okay. Ooh, this is tough. This is tough.
It is tough.
I'm gonna give it 45 out of 50 vultures.
What?
Yep.
So that sounds like 4.5 out of 5 vultures.
I don't know. Maybe. God.
I'd like to say that I was the one who pioneered not abiding by the scale, so everything that comes after me is a ripoff that wasn't as good as the original.
I don't know, I'm doing it better. So, you know.
No, you're just adding extra.
Are you saying I'm modern? No.
Okay.
Too much gore, Sarah.
Oh. Fine, I give it 45 dead children. Okay.
There we go.
Any reason for your score? Were you going to justify it? Or?
No, honestly, we haven't gotten into this, but most of those stars, dead children, are for the last part of the movie because I loved it so much. Yeah. But also, the whole movie as a body is really good, but that can really kill it.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into in a few minutes.
AJ?
I'd give it 5 out of 10.
What?
I understand.
You're giving this classic film. You're giving an acknowledged masterpiece of cinema a middling C plus.
Yeah,
not even a C plus. That's actually a C minus.
Actually, if you're going on grading scales, it's below an F. But
oh my god.
Regardless, here I'll justify.
Okay.
So throughout the film, as I think Will's mentioned in past podcasts, my rating went up and down. At the beginning, it was probably 4 out of 10 or something, which I enjoyed it, but it didn't strike me in any way. In the middle, it went down as far as 3 or 2 out of 10. So I was very bored. But at the end, it earned the 5 out of 10. This is definitely very much a a biased personal rating. You know, like I can definitely see how other people would like it, and it's a good film. And if you like those sort of things, and that's fine. And good on you.
The sorts of things.
There's nothing about this film that really particularly struck me on an emotional level, and that's kind of what I judge films by. It was a good film, and I probably would watch it again if I was faced with the option of not having watched it and able to watch it again.
Right.
I don't believe you.
But if I could, like, you know, spend 2 hours playing LOL instead, I probably would.
Ugh.
But again, I'm a person with no class, so.
So I kind of agree with AJ insofar as this film did not like have a profound emotional impact on me, aside from a sequence near the end, which we can talk about later, which we will talk about in a few minutes. This movie didn't. It wasn't like I was really enraptured or caught up in the film. I think the real challenge, as we talked about a little bit before, with it seems almost silly to give a rating to a classic film that has been ripped off so many times just because its legacy is so profound and just because it's diminished by the fact that you've seen so many imitators before seeing it. That said, there are still some films that were revolutionary when they came out that are not at all diminished by time and by people trying to rip them off. For example, pretty much all of Ingmar Bergman's films. Like, The Seventh Seal is, even though you've seen how many different, like, images of someone playing chess with death, you know, since you know, it just how thoroughly has that like entered or like pop culture iconography or whatever, like how thoroughly ingrained is that in like our shared cultural experience, the idea of someone playing chess with death like that, even though that image has become so ubiquitous, the emotional power of the film is not at any moment diminished by that or by any of the other stuff that has been ripped off since then. And I don't think that's 100% true of M. As I said, I think that some of the film, especially the more procedural central part of the film, the middle third of the film, do not play as well now as they probably did in 1931. That said, there's so much that this film did perfectly the first time around, like we've been talking about. And there's so much that it gets right, and there's so much that happens. Just the enormity of the scope of the film, and just the way it nails every single shot. Even though each and every one of those shots would be ripped off sometime in the future. And just the incredible, like, amazing final third, taking all of that together. Oh, and also, like, the amount of moral ambiguity on display here versus similar films, later films in this genre, the degree to which Peter Lorre's character is ambiguous, the degree to which the cops are portrayed ambiguously, the degree to which the criminals are portrayed ambiguously, and the way your sympathies like ping pong back and forth over the course of the movie, all that is still works incredibly well. All that is still amazing. So I was kind of on the fence between 4 vultures and 4.5 vultures, but because AJ's rating was frankly almost criminal, no like attempt to make a pun or reference to the film there, but since AJ's rating was so egregious, I'm going to give it 4.5 vultures.
Yay!
Fuck you. So I think that concludes the spoiler-free portion of the podcast. Now we are going to move on to our deep dive into our spoiler-inclusive portion. So, as I say on every podcast, now's your chance if you want to watch this film, and do watch this film. What are you doing if you haven't watched this? If you haven't watched this film, turn the podcast off. I don't even care that you don't listen to it all the way. Fuck it. Don't even come back to it. But don't keep going without watching this film. It's a classic. You should see it. But if you can't be deterred and you don't care at all about spoilers and you want to listen anyway, feel free. Otherwise, and if you have seen the movie already, as you know, if you're listening, if you're one of the 5 people listening to this podcast about movies, you've probably seen this classic film. Then hang on, we're going to talk about it in more depth. So, okay, here be dragons past this point. What is it that's hanging, the sign hanging over hell in the inferno? Abandon all hope, ye who enter here, or whatever. So, spoilers ahead. AJ, what? What?
Not all people are spoiler adverse, Theo. It's not all. It's not that dramatic.
I am incredibly spoiler adverse. Okay, if you took like, I don't know, like a third cousin of mine or something, and put a gun to their head and said, I'm either going to spoil Martin Scorsese's Silence, which I'm planning to watch very soon, so don't for you, or I'm going to kill this distant relative, I'd be like, well, buddy, I guess, go right ahead. There's no choice. Do what you're going to do. I'm sorry. But I don't know. I hate spoilers. They really...
Yeah, but you don't love your third cousin.
That's true. I mean, if it was my mom, then I guess I'd have to deal with having Silence spoiled for me.
Sorry, Will's third cousin.
I don't even know if I have a third cousin. Fuck them.
Damn.
We'll probably turn out that our one listener is my third cousin. Yeah. So, anything you guys want to talk about in greater detail?
We should probably say what happens first, right?
Hopefully, they've seen the film.
Oh, damn!
We could lead up to it. Okay, I'll start you off with that. All right. I guess this is the scene where it really starts. Me, anyway. This is where it really got good. It's the scene where you have the blind man who sells balloons, who we saw in the very beginning because he sold Peter Lorre's character a balloon to give to the child who he's about to murder. And that's the one where it ends up in the telephone lines, and it's very, very creepy.
Right.
And that is a good shot. He's just standing there, and he hears this whistling, and he just kind of stops, and he's blind, so he has no idea where this guy is or what he looks like. But he's like, I know I heard that the day that girl was murdered. Somebody a balloon, and he gave it to a child. So I know. So he calls over this. I don't know. Was that a boy or was that a man? I honestly could not.
Young
tell.
Man.
Okay, we'll call him a teenager, and he tells me. He tells him, I heard that whistling the day this girl died, and you need to follow that person, and he does. And he shop, and he's kind of waiting in the shadows. And eventually he realizes he can't just keep following them by himself because that's suspicious. So he gets chalk. I don't know where he gets the chalk from, but his hand and then smacks Peter Lorre's shoulder and marks him with an M for murder. And that way everybody, all the criminals and the two, I believe, to try to find this guy. So that everybody knows it's the guy with the M on his shoulder. That's the guy
Right.
we have to get.
That's the title of the
Yeah,
film.
yeah. Oh, shocker. I really love that part though, because I thought that's actually
Yeah.
pretty innovative. It's so simple, but it's like you mark the guy.
Right.
Unfortunately, he realizes pretty quickly because the little girl he's with, I guess that's his niece. Cool. At least in the version that I was watching.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
I watched it on YouTube.
Victim,
See,
so
me
I'm
too.
not sure.
But I still thought, well, he still might kill her. But in the
I
version I watched,
also
she was calling him
watched-
uncle.
Yeah, I also watched that version.
Yeah, so I thought, okay, so that's his niece. It doesn't mean he's not going to do something though, because he's obviously having this impulse and he's
Or
having
maybe
trouble
that-
controlling it.
Maybe that's like a term of familiarity, like uncle, you know?
Mm.
I
Yeah.
don't
Because you wouldn't
know.
call like
That'd
someone.
be a creepy ass term to call a stranger. Hey,
I mean, I know
uncle.
there's like some differences in other languages of like.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah, it could be a bad translation too.
Right. And I mean, it's not totally uncommon for uncle to be used, just like, you know, different. There are definitely people who use like the terms aunt and uncle to refer to like a male friend or a male
Right,
friend
yeah.
of the family or a female
Mm,
friend of the
right.
family rather than to refer to someone's actual biological uncle.
Mhm.
But I don't
But,
know.
I
I'm not.
think
We watched different translations.
Yeah, it wasn't
I watched
really
it on
clear.
Filmstruck, so
Mm. And yeah, so but I mean, I still got the impression that this girl was probably in danger,
mhm.
since he explains a little later, like I can't control it. I have to kill,
Right,
blah blah
right.
blah, kill her, no matter what she is to him, even if they are blood relation. He's probably gonna do shit to her. But then he quickly realizes that he's being followed and that he's kind of been caught. So he ends up hiding in, I guess it's an office complex.
Yeah, something like
Yeah,
that.
and he ends up getting more or less cornered by all this whole gang of criminals, and they're like trying to break down doors. They're cutting through floors, just trying to find where he
It almost
is.
becomes
like
a
overkill.
heist film. Actually,
yeah,
right?
except not. It was just
Which is really
yeah.
interesting because they're Fritz Lang charging ahead, creating a whole nother genre within.
But so they'll simultaneously show the criminals, and then they'll cut to another scene where Peter Lorre is, kind of cowering, or he's trying to break out of this room because he's locked in, and
Right.
come to a head. He can't really escape,
Right.
and then the police come. But
Right. And what
well, okay, yeah.
what makes that whole sequence so fascinating to me is the degree to which you sympathize with Peter Lorre
Yeah.
during that sequence. Any other film that would have this kind of cat and mouse game going on, even though there's only one killer and there's, a ton of people looking for the killer. I mean, movies do a lot of tricks to make the odds seem more balanced. Like in police procedural, in these kind of serial killer films, it's like, well, we're really only going to focus on these one or two cops, right? And they make the rest of the precinct seem like they're totally disengaged from this serial killer for some reason. They're totally bamboozled. Or they just kind of ignore the existence of all these other cops who might be involved in this massive manhunt in order to make the odds seem more even. And these other films almost inevitably turn the serial killer into some kind of genius or mastermind or really just incredible, somehow superhuman sort of sadist, right? And as a result, you get this impression that even though it's a cat, and often they make the cops incredibly incompetent. And the cops are a little incompetent in this film, but not the kind of profound incompetence that you see where Hannibal Lecter is able to bamboozle everyone at an insane asylum, or everyone the FBI, who are supposed to be at the forefront of investigating these kind of crimes, are always a bunch of dumb shits. This film doesn't do that. It doesn't fall into that trap. Instead, it does something that's really a lot more risky, which is it lets us empathize with Peter Lorre's character, with the killer, by turning him into this hunted animal. And at no point during this film do you really, especially once they start to chase after him, do you ever feel like he has the upper hand? He really is. He's literally a cornered animal. And Peter Lorre's unique, expressive face and
Exactly.
unique acting style really brings out that sense of there being something almost feral about him, but not this kind of like dangerous feral where it's like, oh my god, he's gonna kill like a dozen people. This really trapped, haunted kind of thing, and you naturally, if you have any empathy at all, your sympathy shift towards his character, even though you know just a few scenes earlier you saw him basically grooming a victim.
Hmm.
And the way the film dares to do that, dares to present him as a human being that we can empathize with and that we feel bad for and that we feel even worried about, rather than turning him into some kind of superhuman schemer or a real like monster basically, is I think another instance where this film is better than the films that came after it and ripped it off.
I also love in that scene the fact that they managed to like, I think that part in the film was the closest I got to being emotionally invested in it, because like if you've ever experienced any sort of like, basically if you're in a situation where you think you're in danger and you're running from something,
Right.
like most of the time there's this terrifying unknown of like, you know that they're probably going to catch you, and you're not really sure. Like, even if it's
Right.
not like, if it's not a high stakes engagement, like if you're playing tag with friends and you know the other person's faster than you and you know they're going to catch up to you and you're going to be it, and it's like, it's not, there's no consequences there, but you're still experiencing this kind of high adrenaline terror, and you can really see that in his character, and
Right.
Hmm.
kind of feel it by extension of, and it's really surprising, that turn, because the people chasing him are the ones that you've sympathized with through the entire first half of the movie.
To some degree, although they are also crooks and con artists, which is another thing that I think this movie does well, by having that extra slice or that extra component there where you have the criminals hunting him in addition to the cops. It really heightens the ambiguity there and destroys
Right.
the sense of simple like good cops versus this evil sadistic killer. These guys, and it actually comes up during the trial at the end, but a lot of these guys hunting for him are killers too. They're just not child killers, and they've the safecracker guy has killed something like 3 police officers, and the cops are looking for him because he killed other cops in a shootout. And during the wonderful mock trial scene, which I think is, we'll talk about probably in a minute, but I think is like easily the most brilliant scene in the movie. You have all these people you know are crooks, you know are just, you know, morally compromised themselves, passing judgment on him. So, and you also have the cops using kind of questionable tactics at times too. So you have this kind of moral spectrum as opposed to just black and white. That's really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
And this is another thing that reminded me of The Wire, is the scene where the cops they have this witness, but he doesn't want to talk, so they just fucking lie to him. They're just like, yeah, you know, the security guard you beat up died. Oh shit. you're on the hook for murder now, buddy. And the thing I love that movies still don't. And once again, this is another case where like other movies or might try something like this, but don't go to the same lengths. Where they cut in the scene of the security guard who's just at home, he's eating dinner. He's putting another sausage on his plate, and you realize that the cops are just totally bullshitting this guy, and they're 100% lying to him to get the result that they want, and so you still have that grayness, that ambiguity. And on a similar note, one of my favorite scenes from the otherwise kind of, I don't want to say dull, but the sort of the more difficult central portion of the film was the scene where on the one hand you have the group of criminals meeting to try to, they're holding an impromptu kind of like meeting of the board of directors of the criminal underground or whatever to determine what they're going to do about this problem, because the cops have been putting such a squeeze on them. They need to find a way to take this killer out. And at the same time you're seeing that scene, it's intercut with scenes of a meeting between the cops and the police commissioner, and it's cut in ways where it's sudden too. Like, it takes you a minute to realize they've just cut to another scene, and it's really blends the two worlds together in a way that I think is pretty cool.
I agree. I really like that scene. What was I gonna say? And because there are, I mean, you have the one, you have the law, and then you have the people who break the law, but they're still very similar to each other when you think about it. How
Right.
I was watching that as, yeah, they're both kind of crooked, but they at the same time they're trying to do something good, but maybe not going about it in the most legal way.
Right.
Think about there was the one scene where they're searching the apartment, and they're like, oh, we'll look for an old wooden desk and a red pencil, right? And I thought it was very, very specific. And then they end up finding evidence of both, like, oh yeah, this is the apartment where he lives. Like, really? Really? That's like, how did you know it was a old wooden table? I mean, the red pencil, obviously, but and then what else? I'm trying to think of what the forensics back then would have been like. I know they wouldn't have been that great. I know they had some fingerprinting, but it probably wasn't very extensive.
And the fingerprinting comes up in this scene, and also the candy wrapper they find, and they go with. But a lot of that stuff leads nowhere, which is something that's interesting. That even at this early point in the police procedural, Fritz Lang seems incredibly skeptical about like the efficacy of some of these techniques. My favorite one is the handwriting analysis, where he comes up with this. You've got this Freudian guy, this psychotherapist or whatever, who looks at the killer's note and says a lot of and gives this spiel that's like equal parts meaningless jargon and broad, useless generalizations. Like, oh, this killer may be like teetering on the brink of madness. It's like, oh no.
Oh, and he's an actor.
He has no utility in finding.
I loved in particular that because it also leaked into the shot that we see of the killer himself.
Yeah.
That was pretty excellent.
Where he's looking at his face in the mirror.
Yeah.
And it's almost like he's assessing his humanity. He's like playing with his mouth, and he's like, am I a person? Or like, you get that sense of like, just from that quick shot, you get that sense of he's making some kind of existential assessment. And you see, that's another scene that's been ripped off time and time again, where the killer or where someone looks at themselves in the mirror, and they're like taking an inventory. And usually those scenes are so long. This is just a quick shot cut in between two other scenes, like in the midst of while there's, as AJ said, while the dialogue from the psychotherapist or the handwriting analyst or whatever is playing over it.
It seems really it seems really deep too, because like you're receiving this analysis of the killer by the psychotherapist while you're being introduced to his character,
Right?
And he's also assessing himself, and you are kind of faced with the just kind of like the option of, this one opinion. It seems very obviously garbage, but then you wonder if
Yeah.
that's exactly what the killer himself is thinking about.
Right. Right. That's true. That's a good point. Can we just hold on for a minute? I'm going to run to the bathroom very quickly. I should not have had 2 full glasses of water prior to starting. We'll cut this part out of the podcast. I'll be right back.
I don't know. I think you should bring his computer into the bathroom, and it would make it very interesting. That's what I think. AJ.
Damn.
Okay, I've returned. Did you guys talk at all while I was gone, or is anyone watching the YouTube video just going to be treated to like
We didn't talk at all.
I'm
3
playing a
minutes
word
of
game right
awkward
now.
silence? Damn. I'm going to watch the YouTube video to see if you guys talked about me. Okay.
We didn't.
Didn't
We were
say
good.
anything.
We were very good.
So, all right. So I think we'll start back now. So one scene I definitely want to talk about here is the trial, which you should probably put in quotation marks and square quotes, the trial scene, which I think is the moment in this movie where like it just totally transcends everything that happened before. The moment where yeah. What were you going to say?
No, you can keep going.
Well, I was just going
No,
to
Will,
say
you keep going.
to frame. Well, that. No, you. I just to
Go
frame.
ahead. Keep talking, Will. It's fine. Go ahead.
You know what? Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just turn the podcast over to the two of you, and I won't say anything
No,
else.
please,
Oh my
just go ahead. We're asking you to.
Yeah,
We're
but
not actually being sarcastic.
I don't know. Whatever. So.
No, go ahead. Keep talking, Will.
You know what? Fuck you, AJ. Why don't you tell me what you felt about this scene? The trial scene.
It was great. It was wonderful. It was the only good part of the movie. It would have been better in color, though.
No. Okay, well, I'm going to take my turn now. No, really. No, I think this is what the entire film, it was like, but in the sense of this is what the mass hysteria was leading up to the whole time, was society taking the law into their own hands. It really was a great scene. And you didn't know, oh my God, are they actually going to kill this guy? Or is he going to get off in some way? Or is he going to be spared? And I remember, I told Will this earlier, but the first time I watched it, I was so disappointed that they didn't kill him. I was like, no, come on, get the parents in on it. So because some of the parents were there. And I thought, he murdered their kids.
Really
and so you should kill him. Come on.
I love
but that didn't happen.
So much. I love the fact that they didn't kill him and the fucking police show up at the last second. I love that so much. I think that's like, because it's such a disappointment to the people who want, like, I really enjoyed the moment that, Sarah got really disappointed. Like, I relished that so much.
Well, no, but I wasn't disappointed this time around. In fact, this is the part where we're talking about sympathy. I felt relief for Peter Lorre's character, because he's just like having this huge panic attack, and it's you could see it on his face. He's sweating, he's cowering, he's crying, and you end up, he's a horrible, horrible person, but you end up feeling relief that he's not going to be brutally murdered in the next 5 seconds.
Right. This scene, oh my fucking God, it works on so many levels and in so many different ways. Yes, Mr. Bones. Yes, Mr. Bones. You're creating audio I need to cut out. Yes. Okay. It works just it's nuts. It really is, because if you think about it, at the same time, first of all, this is just this really tense, thrilling moment in the film that makes you feel like scared for this guy who is a multiple child killer. So you have that, which is kind of a continuation of the earlier scenes where you have this building sense of like concern for him. But so that has come to the head. So you have this really thrilling kind of confrontation between the killer and this basically lynch mob that is formed, that's going to kill him, that's going to murder him for his crimes. A lynch mob composed completely of crooks and degenerates, right? Of the lowest caste of society. And that's the other thing. At the same time that's going on, you're also paying off that part of the movie thematically, the part of the movie that's about class stratification. Here you have the same classes that he's been victimizing, the lowest classes of this society, rising up to take a kind of revenge on him. So that pays off thematically. It pays off the like conflict between like the whole overwhelming question of the movie of like what is like this stratification between these different gradations of like law and order, like the idea that somehow because he's a child killer he's more disgusting and depraved than this guy who's killed 3 police officers or all these other crooks who the cops kind of look at them all as being scum basically on some level. And all the moral ambiguity there, all this sense of like, well, on what level can justice be served? What would justice even look like? You know, in this case,
Right.
and questions of on what level is this a compulsion, and on what level does it matter? Like with the mother of one of his victims sitting there in the audience begging for justice for her kid, does it matter that he couldn't help himself? Well, maybe not, but when Peter Lorre's character speaks, it sure feels like it matters. But then when the mother of the child speaks, you think, oh yeah, her kid is dead and she deserves some kind of justice for that. And then
and basically that he needs to be held accountable for this.
Right.
And he's basically saying, I can't be held accountable for my own actions, which
Right.
is,
And it's
I
more-
thought that was bullshit, but
It's also what like the lead, like the judge or whatever, the lead criminal there says of, you know, especially if he can't help it, it's just a matter of, you know, practicality.
right.
Just put him down, you know.
Right, and all of those questions are firing at once in this one rapid fire sequence. Like questions of, well, what's the moral thing to do? What's the practical thing to do? What's the just thing to do? What's the sympathetic thing to do? Like what all of those questions are exploding at once. While you're also, and it never becomes this kind of philosophical dead weight. It never becomes like a thesis on crime and punishment. It is this incredibly tense scene, and on top of that, you have this absolutely stunning monologue from Peter Lorre where he goes from 0 to 100 like that, and he's you know, his eyes are ricocheting around inside his head, and it's just so much there in that moment. And
On top
ultimately,
of that,
yeah.
sorry.
I was just going to say, and ultimately, none of it's resolved because the police come in and take him away. And then you don't get an answer to what the degree to which justice was actually served in his case because we never hear the sentence. The judges come in, they're ready to proclaim his sentence, and it cuts away, and you don't know. You don't know, and you're left with all of that. You're left to process all that. I'm sorry, but AJ.
And on top of that, there's also there's this absurdity that's present in the scene as well, because like Peter Lorre is like begging with the crowd to let him go, and
Right.
you know, they respond by laughing increasingly with like everything that he says.
Right.
And also the fact that they give him a lawyer.
Right. They create this kind of mock justice system. It's this wonderful satirical scene on some level too.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, where where the criminals create this like kangaroo court, but it's not just. I guess I had said a lynch mob, but you're right. It's not a lynch mob because they give him representation. So there's like the
and the
pretense.
representation is convincing to you.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
So there's this pretense that justice is being served, this like veneer, and of course the question then is, well, to what degree is our justice system really different than this kind of lynch mob dressed up as a court? You say, well, maybe not. Maybe the differences are profound. And I like the fact that it blurs those distinctions, the distinctions between the legitimate justice system and the kind of like street justice being enacted by the thugs and the beggars and the criminals. It blurs that distinction just enough to make it ambiguous, to like make you feel like, I don't know, like, but not so completely that it becomes this kind of complete satire where you just assume there's no distinction, that there's no difference between the techniques being used by the cops and the techniques being used by the criminals. You're left in this state where you're not sure. Yes. Sarah,
No, I do agree. Know who to side with during that scene. Reactions from 10 years ago when I first watched this to this morning when I watched it were different. It was, yeah, kill him too. Actually, I don't want them to kill him, even though I don't like him. I think he's horrendous and he's gonna keep killing. He basically is saying that, yeah, I can't help it. I'm gonna keep killing. Kill me because I can't help it. And again, I think there's some BS in there, because I think maybe to some degree he was trying to control it, and then he would just cave which was it, like that scene where he's drinking the cognac.
right?
I think that was him trying to calm his nerves because he was just so up, and his compulsion was so fierce.
Yeah.
But to see him so human during the trial, where he's really probably for the first time in fear of his own life. Probably he was always scared of getting caught, and oh my God, it's actually happened. But it's he's not just faced with a bunch of strangers; he's faced with the parents of his victims. Oh my God,
Right.
It was powerful in that sense.
Yeah, and you raised
But we don't know like what happened to him.
We don't. We have no idea ultimately what happened to him. And I mean, one possible way to approach the film, it doesn't have to be a choice between this crowd murders him, lynches him, basically, or he gets all scot-free to kill again. There's a possibility that the justice system functioned properly. He was locked away either in an asylum or in prison for the rest of his life, and he never
Right.
killed again, and the
Right.
justice system works. But everyone on screen, especially, well, once again, you have to think of who are the ones in this scene who think they're handing out justice. But it's a bunch of criminals, and how much faith the criminals have in the justice system to work properly. So I mean, but you don't know. I mean, how much weight do you put on their assessment of the system? Well, you could put a lot of weight on it if you're cynical about the justice system, or you could put very little on it if you think someone like this is going to get his just desserts. And there's a real chance, by the way, that the justice system is just going to hang him or execute him otherwise anyway.
See, that's what I thought. I thought, well, at this point, they might not put him in an asylum because he's killed 8 children.
Right.
At this, you know what I mean? And then because everybody was saying, oh well, they're gonna put him in an asylum, then he's gonna get out. They kept saying he's gonna escape, which I don't know about that.
Yeah.
And then he'll just be able to keep killing, basically, which I didn't really think was gonna happen, but that seemed to be what they were convinced of.
Yeah. And maybe, I mean, it's a question
to
we're
kill
left
him,
to
right?
ponder. But Sarah, you brought up the question of like how much of this is a compulsion, because that's his whole argument. That's his whole defense. I can't help myself. And in scenes like the scene where he at the cafe where he seems to be trying to fight the urge and just struggling with it, it does seem like maybe he can't help himself. But boy, when he's there, when you see him with a potential victim, first Elsie in the initial scene, in the first scene where the first murder you see on, well, you don't see any of the murders on screen, but the first murder that happens in the actual course of the movie, the way he interacts with her, and later when he interacts with the other girl, when the beggars are trailing him, boy, that doesn't look like a guy who's seized by compulsion, does it? It
He
seems an
is
awful lot like a
Yeah.
calculating
He's
kind
so
of
collected.
snake, you know? He doesn't.
Exactly how I saw him too. I think it's when it came down to, defend himself and say, I can't stop it. It's like some force is making me do it, blah blah blah. But yeah, if you look at all the other scenes of him, he's like smirking, he's calculated, he's calm. So I don't think it's just
And he's
compulsion
tactical
that
too.
he can't fight.
He has a method in place for basically seducing these kids. And how much of that is premeditated? And if it is premeditated, how much of a compulsion is it? And the letter that we see is kind of equally ambiguous. I mean, is that letter that he sends him taunting the police, as it usually is in, future movies that rip that? By the way, that ripped that off too. Or is it him begging to be caught? The text is really questionable. It's really ambiguous, where he's basically saying, you're going to find me, you're going to catch me, you're going to find me out in due time. That's really weird if it's him taunting the police. In some level, it seems like him begging to be caught, but on the other level, it's not like he turns himself in there. And there's a certain smugness to it too, so...
Right. I saw it as him taunting the police, honestly, but I think you're right. It's pretty much how you interpret it.
Right. AJ, any thoughts on premeditation versus compulsion here?
Yeah, I mean, it could definitely go either way. I really like the fact that it doesn't, to me, it doesn't seem like you could make the argument that it's completely compulsion, regardless of your stance on it. It doesn't seem like he's being, forced against his will in every way. Like, he's indulging in it at best. At worst, whichever one, but you can see that he is indulging in it, regardless of how much of that is messed up wiring in his brain or whatever. It could just go either way. And
Right.
I like leaving it that way because, you can't really come to a resolution at all.
No, you can't. You can't. And I think it would, just like it would be very hard to make the argument that it's pure compulsion, I think the argument that it's purely premeditated malice or something is a very hard one to make too.
And it would be rather cheapening to make the argument that it's completely premeditated.
Right. So, anything else that anyone wanted to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
Can't think of anything.
So one thing I wanted to mention quick at the end here. We've talked a lot about the ending of the film, but we haven't talked about the actual, honest to goodness, final scene of the film. Really, there are two or three final scenes depending on how you look at it. But there a sequence of three things happen at the end of the film, right? You have the mock trial scene. You have the trial scene. The initial trial scene, that's the scene where he's being tried by the criminals. And that's a very long, protracted scene. And then after that scene, there are two other brief moments that could either be considered a single scene or two scenes, I guess, depending on how you look at it. And first you get the dignified judges file in their robes and they announce that they're ready to basically proclaim a sentence. And you of course you don't get closure on that. And I thought all of that, both the mock trial scene and the actual moment with the judges coming in to get their verdict, were very effective. But then there's a third moment at the very, very end of the film where it cuts suddenly to the three mothers sitting there in black. And they're like, oh, it basically this doesn't bring our children back, and we need to watch our children more closely. And how did you guys feel about that? And that's the note he chooses to end on.
Yeah, which I thought was a little weird, honestly, given the rest of the film. But I guess at the same time, they're ending it with the same mother from the beginning, who's really the only parent that we see affected.
Right.
Was the right one. But,
I think she's one of the three that are there.
But I don't know. That scene didn't. It's like this doesn't bring our children back, but it didn't have a huge impact on me either.
Yeah.
For some reason, no, we need to watch our children more closely. And that also speaks of society back then, where you could just walk around at night if you wanted and probably have not much happen to you. Whereas nowadays, you don't do that. You don't let your children just walk alone in the dark. Well, at least most parents don't, I would say.
Right. I mean, I don't know. AJ, how did you feel about that ending?
I mean, it didn't really strike any particular chord with me. I mean,
I felt like I felt like they wanted to strike a chord, though.
Yeah.
But it didn't really work.
Honestly, it felt like a public service announcement to me.
Yeah.
It did?
Yeah. It did.
And it was very jarring. I don't know. I was kind of hoping one of you would come up with a persuasive argument for it, because it did not.
See, that's your
seemed like
job,
a little.
Will.
Yeah, but it seemed a little bit like a blemish on the scene for me. I would have loved the movie to have ended with the judges filing in, and no, and it just to have ended there, and we don't know. And we don't know what happened, and it's just open and it's ambiguous. But it almost feels like he had, I don't know, and this is speculation, but it's almost like that moment where you have to give the studios something, like give us a moral point here, and the moral point becomes shoot, just a second, okay, and the moral point becomes, well, we need to take better care of our kids, which is so reductive when you have this massive sociological web laid out for you throughout over the course of the film, with all of these different pitfalls and all of these different conflicting incentives, to have it end on, we should be better to our kids.
Especially since it doesn't seem relevant at all. Like, there was no build up to that in particular previously.
Right, and it may not be it's one of these things where it may not be a problem that the mother can solve. I mean, the thing was, it's not like that Elsie's mother was just neglectful of her kid. She had to work as a washerwoman, and she was a single mother, and she couldn't walk there and see her home from school, so she had to wait for her to get home. And she was making dinner while she was waiting for her to come home. So it seems like the movie lays out all of these sociological issues that don't have an easy answer, and to have an ending like that seems kind of pat. I thought
it seemed out of place. Yeah, I like it. It really did sound like a service announcement.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's like, so that wasn't the point of the film. Watch your children more. What?
Right. Just gotta take better care of the kids, guys.
It seems like
that was a really weird scene.
It seems like it should be, and that it did say more than what it was like audibly saying, of like, watch your kids better. But I can't piece together.
Well, I mean,
no.
The most generous interpretation would be that it's a final reminder of like the real human cost of this whole thing, that like above and beyond abstract questions of justice and all of this, you still have these mothers who have lost their children and are not going to get their children back, and are going to have to deal with the psychological and personal costs of that for the rest of their life.
Hmm.
And ending on a note like that, I would have been fine with, but the exact way it plays out in the film was too heavy-handed for me.
Yep.
Awkward silence, but I think we both agree with you.
Okay.
It was heavy-handed and just one that was very well put together. The ending just made no sense for a film of that kind of quality.
Yeah. I agree. Okay, well then I think that pretty much wraps it up, right? I think we've got this covered.
I have to go to the bathroom, so.
Okay. Well then I think we'll end there. So that was M. Tune in again next time, and usually we release an episode every couple of weeks or so. Sometimes it's a little more than that. But, subscribe to us on iTunes. Check out the website, miserytourism.com. You'll find a lot of other content there, including some of Sarah's other serial killer related content. And yeah, check out the website. Give us a rating or review on iTunes. Just generally be good to us. We don't deserve it, but be good to us anyway. And yeah, that's it. We'll see you again for episode 9 when we'll be discussing a new miserable movie. So, Sarah, AJ, we're gonna say goodbye here.
Adios. No.
No. What the? Okay. Well, whatever. Sarah's gonna be difficult, but bye. Fuck it.